Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to go now to lecture number 10, which is a continuation of our discussion about the stakes, the interest, relationships of secondary stakeholders to projects. We had started talking about the secondary stakeholders and their relationship to projects as well as their stakes and interests in the preceding lecture, lecture number 9. And I had talked about many different types of stakeholders. I talked about academia, the media. I talked also about competitors and civic and professional organizations and so forth. Now what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about a few other categories of secondary stakeholders, such as families, such as local communities and the general public. And I'm going to focus a lot on the countries as secondary stakeholders. So now starting with our class, families. Families are very important stakeholders on projects. Not on every project, of course, depends on the type of project, but they can be a very important stakeholder. Families have their interests and their stakes. They share a fundamental desire to live in a comfortable, peaceful, clean, healthy, secure, and child-friendly environment. They have certain demands which they expect projects to fulfill, not to infringe upon. Families understandably tend to be concerned about the impact on them of some projects which are being undertaken in their neighborhoods and communities, such projects may have consequences which conflict to some extent with this fundamental desire, that is, comfortable, peaceful, clean, healthy, secure, and child-friendly environment. If the project is consistent with these desires, good enough, but if there is a conflict between the project and some of these desires, where, for example, the hygiene of the environment or the security of the environment is maybe negatively affected, well then families would be particularly concerned, of course. What are the types of projects where you would expect families to be interested in? Well, construction projects in particular. Why? Well, you know, if you ever have lived at or near a construction site, you know that construction sites, they can be inconvenient. There is a lot of noise. There is a lot of dust, there's a lot of dirt, you know, which may be lying on the road. There might be a lot of influx of people, and you might be concerned about some of the people who have come in. There's a lot of pollution and so forth, diversion of road traffic. Well, all these are inconveniences. And if you're living in a neighborhood such as that, where all these things are taking place, well, then you as a family could feel inconvenienced. So that means that this project which is taking place is inconveniencing you. There is a direct relationship. You are directly affected, in this case negatively. So you could expect families particularly to be a little bit concerned about such projects which are taking place directly at or near their doorstep. Having said that, there are also a large number of projects which families would be particularly interested in. They would be particularly liking or supporting. And these type of projects could be, for instance, creation of playgrounds in your local neighborhood. There might have been a wasteland, or there might have been some old derelict parking lot or something which is no longer needed. And this location or this place is turned into a playground, you know, for children, where they can all, you know, roam around and scream around and, you know, sort of chase each other. Well, these are the types of projects which families would be supportive of, because it gives them somewhere to go to and take their children. It enhances their quality of life. The same way parks. A project to set up a new park, it's very nice. You can walk around there, you can relax, you can take a book, you can have a picnic, you can play around. Very good for families. Of course, you know, creating a park or creating a playground does entail some inconveniences. As I just pointed out, dust and dirt, you know, when earth is being dug up, when machinery is being brought in, when digging is excavating is taking place, when filling of land is taking place, etc. These are inconveniences, but the result is very family friendly. So families, in many cases, they would be willing to put up with those inconveniences in order to reap the benefits later on when the projects are finished. Other projects which families might like: daycare centers for children, sport and recreational facilities, gyms, swimming pools, for instance, nurseries and schools, of course, libraries, and so forth. These are all projects which would which families would have a very high interest in, they would have a stake in, and they would be generally supportive of, at least when the project goes into operation, if not when the project is under execution, which is then somewhat inconvenient for families. Local communities are extension of families, a whole community of people. Like the families which form their basis, local communities are affected by and hence have an interest in the projects which are being implemented in their respective localities. There are many reasons why local communities may be affected, why they have an interest, which may be economical, maybe financial, maybe cultural. For example, projects may bring numerous benefits for local communities, such as employment generation. If you look at, let's say, a construction project which is taking place, they might need people, they might need skilled people, semi-skilled people, and one place where they could look for them would be in the immediate community, where there might be a number of job seekers, for instance. Another benefit for the local community could, for example, be business and investment opportunities. When a big project is taking place, of course, materials are needed. It could be simple materials, could be more sort of sophisticated materials, inputs, services also, not only physical inputs but also service inputs. So there are investment there for businesses, and opportunities also for investment possibly in the project. Access to more goods and services. For example, if there is a project to construct a shopping mall, when the shopping mall is complete, there will be a lot of new places available where one can go, one can do shopping, one can find goods, one can find services. All this would be appreciated by most, if not all, people in the local community. A very important interest which local communities may have in a project which is ongoing in their proximity would be the effect of that project on property values. How will the project affect property values? Will the property values go up as a result of the project, or will they go down as a result of the project? For instance, if you have projects ongoing which are transforming your locality, which are transforming your town, let us say, into a sort of a cultural oasis, you know, where you are getting a lot of new cultural facilities. Example, museums are being opened, libraries are being opened, institutes are being opened, and so forth. All these things, these projects, they will enhance the attractiveness of your locality. In other words, more and more people would like to move there to avail all these facilities, which in turn can give rise to an appreciation of property values. Of course, there's also the downside. You might have a project setting up some chemical industry, which might bring employment generation, investment and business benefits for some, but for others it might result in a depreciation or a going down of their property values, maybe as a result of less demand for people to live in an area where there is a chemical factory because of the potential hazards which are associated with the chemical industry, like pollution, leakage of chemicals into the water supply, or maybe risk of explosion or attack or something like that. So the local communities, they have got many different reasons why they should be supportive or not so supportive of projects. And of course, one has to look at the perspective of the individual stakeholder. You might have two stakeholders who are living next to each other, and one says, yes, I like this project because I'm going to benefit, I'm going to work for the project, and afterwards when the project goes into operation, I'm going to be there a full-time employee, so there are a lot of economic benefits for me. And the other will say, no, maybe I'm an elderly person, retired, all this project is going to bring about a lot of hustle and bustle in the neighborhood, and I don't like it. I like peace and quiet, and this project is not for me. I don't like it. You can have, within the local community, you have different stakeholders who can have very different perceptions of the project and the benefits and the problems which it can bring. Having said that, I would like to point out that local communities tend, by and large, to be receptive to change, and every project brings about change, as long as they perceive its benefits are greater than its costs. Now, this is a very rational way of thinking. If you think that a project is going to bring you more benefits than it's going to cost, then rationally speaking, you would tend to support that project because you are having a net gain from that project. The same way, if you perceive that the project is going to bring you more loss than it's going to bring you gain, then you would tend to oppose that project because you perceive that there's going to be a net loss for yourself as a result of that project. One can also say that the higher the benefit differential, I mean, if you perceive the net gains to be very high, you will be comparatively more supportive of the project than you would be if the net gains would be not so high, and vice versa. If you perceive the net losses are going to be very high, you will be comparatively more adversarial or opposing that project than you would be if you perceive the net gains to be not so, the net losses to not so high. Yeah. So this is what stakeholder management and engagement looks at. It looks at all these different dimensions, dimensions of benefits, the dimensions of cost, and then it gives you some insight into how your local communities, how your stakeholders there can be expected to behave in connection with the project. Again, just as I pointed out here, this is just a reiteration of what I have said, that many projects, especially those in construction of buildings, roads, public facilities and infrastructure, although they do have a benefit, they are intended to have a benefit for the community, as long as they're under implementation, they can have a big nuisance effect in terms of noise, dust, dirt, pollution, traffic diversion, etc. So you have to see your project in the context of its implementation, how stakeholders are going to react, and in the context of its operation after the project has been completed, how the stakeholders are going to react. And local communities, they can exercise various options to support or oppose projects. They can go to the local administration, they can have rallies, they can organize petitions, they can organize boycotts, they can go to the politicians, they can go to the courts, etc., etc., etc. So all kinds of options which we will look at in a later class. The general public. Now the general public is an extension of communities. Just as communities are extensions of families, of individuals that make up those families, the general public is an extension of local communities. It's on a much broader level. Most projects, they have a limited stakeholder outreach. Those smaller projects which are related to a particular locality, which in terms of their stakeholder context are very limited. But on the other hand, there are also projects. They are very large-scale projects. And these projects, because of their magnitude, because of the scale of the projects, they can cause a big interest and effect on the general public. Now, if you take a look at, for example, construction of a highway linking a country's major cities, Islamabad to Lahore motorway, for instance, or Islamabad to Peshawar motorway, or some of the other highway schemes which are now under consideration, linking the country from north to south and all the major cities, all the way up to Karachi. Well, Construction of a highway, such a highway linking a country's major cities, would make traveling more convenient for the public. And of course, it'll be a very large number of people involved, a very large number of stakeholders who would be using such major highway routes. The construction of power stations to overcome a country's chronic electricity outages would affect everyone. If you look at, for instance, the case of Pakistan at the moment, where power outages are not only acute, but they're also chronic, meaning that they are large and they are enduring. Well, if there are now major projects, building very large dams or very large thermal power stations, or even some nuclear stations or solar and wind power stations, which are coming into vogue in this country now, well, the construction of these power stations, they would basically affect everyone who is connected to the electricity supply in this country. In that case, they may have to endure less or maybe no power outages in future. So in this case, the general public, which will be all those using this electricity, which will be most of the public probably, they would be a stakeholder in such schemes, in such projects. Of course, the general public wants to be assured that a project will not cause problems for it, in that, for example, it causes an untenable economic burden for them in future. Coming back, let us say, to these power stations. Now, if power stations are constructed which have a collective capacity of, 7, 8, 9,000 megawatts, which is quite a large sum of power, which probably would be sufficient to overcome the current power outages, that will be a good thing, but of course that will come at a heavy price. Power stations are not cheap, and they have been getting progressively more costlier with the passage of time. And it's not only the construction of these power stations, it's not only the project phase of planning, designing, constructing and commissioning the power stations, but then of course it's also the operationing of them. If you have thermal power stations, you need the inputs, the fuels or the gas or the coal, whatever you have got to power those stations. So there's also a lot of cost which is involved during the project and when the project goes into operation, after the project is completed. And this also can cause a lot of financial burden on an economy, depending on the amount of investment which is needed in order to bring about such projects. So yes, the general public, they are in favor of such projects. At the same time, they also may be concerned about the costs of these projects. There may be a point when they say, okay, we are not going to support this project because even though it brings us benefits, it comes at much too great a cost. And this cost which will be invested, that could have been perhaps invested better somewhere else, which would have given elsewhere benefits which may be more than the benefits which would be derived from these projects. So one always has to, see both sides of the equation. Building large new food and beverage factories, for instance, would also interest the general public by giving them access to a broader and possibly cheaper selection of projects. If you think about it, you have some beverage factories here making juices and all kinds of drinks. And if you build some large new factories which can cater to demand in the whole country, you could expect, for instance, the general public would be happy to have those projects because they would be providing them other drinks which might not be on sale. Some projects can be a source of major concern for the general public. If you look at this creation of databases to enable governments to store information on their citizens. Now, these have been opposed by the public in many countries. Databases of fingerprints, databases of DNA. Not only that, but in this post-9/11 situation, environment, you have all kinds of data, where people are going, who they are meeting, what kind of websites they are accessing, financial transactions, where are they sending money, who is receiving money, and all these things which are now thanks to information and communication technology, the advances in information and technology, it's all becoming quite easy now to actually record all this information and to store all this information and to access and use this information. And the thing about information is that quite often it's not always accurate. And this can lead then to wrong conclusions about people being drawn from information which is available in such databases, and these wrong conclusions can actually have a very negative impact on the people. I am aware of cases where, for instance, people have applied for jobs. Not in Pakistan, this is outside. People have applied for jobs and they were rejected, and they did not know why. And then later on it was found out, well, there was some information about them which was collected secretly in some database, and it was not even always correct information, but because of that information they were denied employment. So, and there are many examples in all categories. So the general public can be quite concerned about such projects now in our information age. The general public is not privy to the actual goings-on in projects, and its perceptions are largely based on what it reads, hears from the media. You remember the previous class I talked a lot about the media, and I pointed out that the media sometimes can be very selective in its reporting, can be very biased in its reporting, can project one side. The views of one side may not project the views of the other side, or it may give overemphasis to the views of one side. It may not give sufficient emphasis to the views of the other side. Now, most of the projects which are taking place, the general public is not sitting there and watching the work which is going on. The general public is not sitting in the project managers or the project team members' offices and is listening to what is going on. But the general public gets its information from somewhere, and this somewhere is, of course, the media. So, again, perceptions are largely based on information which is received, which is then processed by the mind. And these perceptions may be right, they may not be right, based on factual information. So it is possible, in other words, to manipulate the general public by making them believe that something is in their interests, which it may really not be in their interests, and vice versa, of course. So general public, they have a stake in projects, as you have seen, especially in those projects which tend to affect the whole public to some extent or the other, whether it's construction type projects, the highway, dam, big energy projects which I have just pointed out, or whether it's something like creating databases to go and monitor what people actually are doing. Now, I would like to go into the next category of secondary stakeholders on which I'm going to focus the rest of this lecture, and that is countries. And I had pointed out to you in one of the preceding lectures that countries can also be stakeholders to projects. The number of projects here would be relatively small compared to the total number of projects which are taking place. But there are projects which countries are involved in, and these projects tend to be generally of a more larger scale, more substantive nature. As we know, all projects have an impact. Impact is change. Every project is done with the purpose of bringing about change. The change, hopefully, is positive. We do projects to bring about positive change, but of course, projects also can have side effects, negative side effects. You can have positive side effects, but they can also have negative side effects, which are change which is not particularly desirable, which we not intended, which we really don't want to have, but which is a consequence of the project. In the case of large projects, mega projects, these impacts or these change effects sometimes do not stop at national borders or boundaries, but they actually transcend these national borders, boundaries, and they can affect surrounding countries also. might be positively, in many cases also negatively. What one country is doing in terms of projects within its national borders, it can have repercussions for another country, which may or may not be adjacent to that country where the project is ongoing. And there are many examples of this. If you look at, for instance, water management projects on major river systems, and there are some rivers, or many rivers actually, they do not only flow within the country, but they cross the national boundaries of a country. And if you look at the Rhine River, for instance, in Europe, which starts, I believe, in Switzerland, then it goes in through Germany. There's also in the Low Countries, Netherlands, Belgium, and then it empties into the North Sea. That's a river which goes across several countries. Or the rivers in Turkey, Euphrates and Tigris, which also go into Syria and Iraq. Since rivers usually flow through more than one country, this means that a project to store or divert river water in one upstream country may, as a consequence, result in a reduction of water flows to the neighbors of that country which are downstream. The water is flowing, say, from north to south across 2 or 3 countries, and the northernmost country decides to store or divert that water. Well, then the water flows to the neighboring countries down south. They will be negatively affected. There will be a reduction in the flow of water. Now, this reduced flow of water, it does have an impact, a very negative impact on the downstream countries. It may be benefits for the upstream country or countries, but it have negative benefits or negative consequences for the downstream countries. Reduced water flows may, for example, damage their agriculture. The crops don't have enough water. And economies, because economies might be dependent on agriculture. And industries also need a lot of water. And if there's a reduced flow of water, then the industries also have to cope with less water. Besides having a social fallout. If your economy is affected, of course, that has direct social implications. And if this is uncontrolled, a situation may arise where countries are even willing to engage with each other in armed conflict. Because of this water example, the countries downstream, they have been so adversely affected economically, socially, politically, that they are even willing to engage in an armed conflict in order to bring back the original flow of water supplies. It's not without reason that many are saying that the 21st century, our century, will be the century of water wars. And it's not only in this region here, it's in many places around the world. Example is Turkey, which almost went to war with Iraq and Syria many years ago. This was precisely over this Turkish plans to divert water from the rivers which were flowing through Turkey into Iraq and Syria. Iraq and Syria, they are desert countries by and large, and they are really dependent on this water. There were no alternative sources of water. The cause for this near conflict was Turkey's construction of a series of dams on a river shared by all 3 countries. And that's also why nowadays a lot of research is ongoing in terms of water management and in terms of effects of water management on economies and people who are living along the water. Secondary stakeholders transcending national boundaries, that is stakeholders without boundaries, without borders. Single countries, groups of countries, even the whole international community can be stakeholders in some projects. Sounds big. In particular, infrastructure mega projects and wars may have millions of stakeholders transcending national, region and continental borders. You see here it's a map of the world, and there are some projects which might affect certain parts of this map in certain continents. You have here North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia. You have here the 6 continents. Antarctica is the 7th continent we can leave out. It is only inhabited by penguins and some scientists at the moment. Well, if you look at these 6 continents over here, and just think that here are all the countries. You can see all the lines which have been drawn. These all represent the borders of countries, and that there are many projects which are transcending national borders. Might be just a few borders, might be a whole region, might be several continents. Most projects are typically confined within national borders, but their impacts, both positive and negative, as I said, may be felt well beyond. Some projects actually transcend national borders. The river projects which I talked about, the dam projects, they are done within countries, but they have effect on other countries outside. But there are actually some projects which physically themselves cross national borders, transcend national borders. And in these instances, the states and their citizens who are affected by these projects, of course, are stakeholders. Now, I'll be going into some of these projects in a second, but from a stakeholder perspective, transnational projects can fall in any of three categories. Now, this is my category scheme, which I have drawn up. Divisive, collaborative, and integrative. These are the three categories which I have developed: divisive, collaborative, and integrative, in terms of transnational projects, which can be either projects which are done within a country or projects which physically transcend across borders. Now, transnational projects, especially in infrastructure, for example, in the field of energy, in the field of transportation, they can entail substantive and long-term mutual assured gains. Now, these gains can be, for example, economic, financial, political, social, technological, institutional, informational gains for all states involved. These are some transnational projects. If you see, for example, an energy pipeline which is going across 2 or 3 countries, it brings benefits. If you look at, for example, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, which of course has not been built yet, but which has been discussed a lot and for which there is general support, even though there are some formidable obstacles. All the 4 countries, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, can benefit. Turkmenistan, it's a big gas producer. They have very large reserves of natural gas. The benefit for them would be that they can sell their gas, in this case to their southern neighbors, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, whereby especially Pakistan and India would be the customers for that gas. So there is a clear benefit for Turkmenistan there, economic benefits, and of course political benefits, and you could say also security benefits in terms of diversification. Instead of relying only on 1 or 2 customers, Russia, for instance, some other countries, they can now expand, they can diversify their customer base, and that is also more security for them, besides bringing political benefits. Afghanistan could, for its part, benefit in terms of the royalties it would receive by acting mainly as a transit land for the pipeline. The pipeline has to go through Afghanistan. They would collect royalties, they would collect fees for that for the duration of the pipeline, as long as it continues providing gas to Pakistan and India. Pakistan and India would benefit, of course, as customers. They need gas, energy deficient countries, growing quite fast economically, population expanding, need for energy resources, and energy is not always easy to come by. So if they have a country which is almost in their neighborhood, which is almost bordering them, which can provide this gas, it's a benefit for them. And it's something which they would go for. So for all the countries concerned, there are a lot of benefits. Of course, there are also costs, but there are benefits. And when one is talking about transnational programs, transnational projects, or transnational agreements, then it's very important also, as I had pointed out earlier, that all the stakeholders should have the perception, at least, that they are getting a net gain from that scheme, whether it's a project or program or whatever. There should be a perception of net gain, because if they have a perception that they're going to lose or there's going to be a net loss, they're not going to be very supportive of that project. And if they're not supportive, then the whole thing can fall apart. So this is one thing which one has to keep in mind. Let me now look at the different categorizations of projects. I had pointed out that there are, in my opinion, three categorizations. One is divisive, one is collaborative, and one is integrative. Let's take the first one, divisive. Divisive, divides, creates conflict. You can see there's two people over here at each other's throat, fighting with each other. They represent symbolically countries. Now, divisive projects, they can cause friction between states. And there could be adverse consequences, for example, economic consequences, political consequences, which may result from such projects. In the extreme case, interstate conflict, confrontation, military confrontation, war is a possibility even. Some examples which I have listed over here. Well, one example is wars generally, but this we don't want to go in at the moment. Let us look at the nuclear weapon programs of North Korea and Iran. Now, for their reasons, which they consider justified, North Korea and Iran both have been pursuing nuclear weapon development programs. They might deny it. In the case of North Korea, it cannot be denied because they have already exploded a device. Iran is strongly denying it. Whether it's true, whether it's not, we're not here to debate that. But there is a perception that these countries have and are developing nuclear weapons. Now, nuclear weapon programs, as I pointed out, are also collections of projects. Project to develop nuclear weapons and programs to develop nuclear weapons. These are divisive because not all countries are supportive of such programs. In the case of North Korea and Iran, you have very powerful secondary stakeholder, the United States, which is very opposed to these countries and their nuclear programs. You also have the European Union, and you have some other countries. In the case of Iran, there have been a lot of sanctions in the last couple of years, all kinds of sanctions against Iran, against export of nuclear-related material and equipment, which could be used to make nuclear weapons, financial sanctions, a boycott on importing oil from Iran, refusal to provide certain technologies, and so forth, a long list. As you can see that there are secondary stakeholders here, and in this case they have resorted to the options which were available to them, sanctions for instance, boycotts, but of course there are other options which they have not exercised yet, which could be military strikes, targeted strikes, or even a full-scale war. The fact is, the point I'm trying to make here is that these programs, they have got adverse consequences in the sense that there is a lot of opposition to them, and this opposition has been translated into practical countermeasures. As a second example of divisive projects, you could consider the expansion of Jewish settlements in East Jerusalem, which is very controversial. New settlements, constructing new houses, new facilities over there. The local population is opposed to it, which is living over there. And there are many other countries around the State of Israel which are opposed to these settlements, which have also been criticized by the European Union and by some other organizations and countries. So this is a second example of divisive projects, which one country is undertaking, but which can encounter opposition in other countries also, for one reason or the other. Closer to home, look at India's dam construction projects on the Indus River system. India says that, well, it's a very large country, and it also has a shortage of water, and it has over 1 billion people. It also has to meet their water needs, which is why they are constructing these dams on the Indus. Pakistani position, of course, is that, well, it's not consistent with the agreements which have been made in this water treaty and so forth, and that these dams should not be built. So there's one side, the Indian side, which is very much in favor of building these dams. There's another side, the Pakistan side, which is very much opposed to building these dams. And it really remains to be seen what happens. There's a lot of drama going on with Kishan Ganga, and then whether these dams on the Pakistan side will be built and whether they can be built in time, etc., etc., etc. Only time will tell. But this is a big point of contention between India and Pakistan at the moment. A very good example of divisive projects in one state, which meets a lot of opposition in another state. Final example over here, the Spratly Islands, a collection of islands in the South China Sea, which is heavily contested by several countries which are nearby in the proximity of these islands, the Philippines, for instance, Vietnam, China, all of which are contesting these islands for one reason or the other, probably because they are very rich in energy resources, and of course, if you're rich in energy resources, then that's a good reason to sometimes go to conflict. But the fact is that any project done by any one country immediately raises an outcry from other countries. Drilling, oil exploration, gas exploration, even sending of ships, or even docking or landing on some islands for scouting missions. So this is another example of very divisive projects. And of course, the list goes on and on and on. I just wanted to illustrate the point over here, and I think it has been illustrated well enough. This is what I pointed out earlier. The 21st century will be called the era or the century of water wars. Proposed dam construction and river diversion projects are presently at the center of several transboundary water resource conflicts around the world, because they can cause severe disruption to agriculture, economy, and society downstream. It's not only in Turkey, it's not only in Pakistan, India, it's also in Southeast Asia, it's also in South America, and also, I believe, some parts of Africa. Divisive, another example of projects which can be decisive is military conflict between states. Well, first you might ask yourself, how can wars be considered projects? Not every war can be considered a project. For instance, the world wars, they were not projects. But there are some wars, or military expeditions rather, which have got the same characteristics as projects do, in the sense that there is a goal, there is a certain cost involved, budgeted, estimated, and there is a certain time frame in which the military expedition or the war, if you may want to call it, has to be completed. The world wars were, the First World War at least was very spontaneous, so you can't really call it a project. But some of these wars which have, or military expeditions which have project-like status, they can have a very large number of stakeholders too. If you look at the Allied invasion of Iraq in March 2003, that is a case in point. I mean, it had a goal, it was prepared over many months, there were a lot of estimates, a lot of planning, a lot of inputs were there, time frame was there, so there were a lot of project-like sort of parameters and characteristics. And of course this has been very divisive, the Iraq war. It has caused a lot of opposition around the world. It's also not been only a big tragedy in our present time, not only had a huge impact on society, but it has also had ripples, negative ripples all over the world. The most affected stakeholders include not only the citizens of Iraq, who have paid an astronomical price, among other things in terms of lives, economic ruin, massive erosion in quality of life, but it's also the US and the Allies who have incurred enormous financial burden, human cost, loss of lives, material cost, as well as threat of terrorist reprisals, which has also reduced the quality of life because of the extra security we have now And as I pointed out, the databases which are there, which are monitoring citizens and which can also cause problems for them sometimes. So it's been a very divisive project, if you would like to call it a project, which not only has affected the country of Iraq, but has also affected the neighbors, as well as countries which are far away from it. A hypothetical example of a divisive project. It hasn't been done, probably never will be done, but it's possible. And I've taken this example because I wanted to show you that if this project were to be undertaken, then the whole world would be a stakeholder. I pointed out earlier, divisive projects, I mean, there can be some countries involved, but some projects also can cause the whole world to be involved. In the very unlikely event that the countries of the Amazon basin, this is here 11 or 12 countries in South America, if they ever decide to initiate a joint project to clear the entire Amazon rainforest, well, then the whole world would be stakeholders. Why? Because if this whole forest over here was cleared, it's actually considered the lung of the world. Then the climatological consequences would be so immense, then it would have a great impact on the climate, which would then have a great impact on everything else. So even though it's not a project, and it probably never will be a project, but if this project was to be implemented, if everyone would get together and decide to chop down the Amazon forest as a project, well, then it would have worldwide repercussions. All of us would be stakeholders because we would be affected by it, by the fallout, by the consequences of it, by the climate change, and so forth. Okay, so now I have looked at divisive projects in a transnational context from the eye of the secondary stakeholders. Now let us look at the second category, which is given here, collaborative projects. Now divisive, as I said, divides. Collaborative, collaborate, brings together, cooperate. Now these type of projects, they help bring states closer together, politically, economically, or in other spheres, institutionally, technologically, culturally, etc., etc. So these types of projects are relationship drivers, facilitators. They facilitate relationships, as opposed to divisive projects which impede or which strain relationships. Now, what are some of the examples of collaborative projects? And one I had already given you, that was the TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India gas pipeline. That would be a collaborative projects where you have several countries which are collaborating, which are cooperating, working together with each other. Some examples given over here: transnational oil and gas pipeline projects in Central Asia and the Caucasus. In the attempt to diversify away from the Russian Federation, many of the Central Asian republics, they have been exploring pipeline options for their oil, for their gas, to market their oil and gas in Europe, not through Russia or through Ukraine or Eastern Europe, but through alternative routes, for example, through Turkey, through the Mediterranean. This is one example here of collaborative projects, because these projects cannot be done unless all these countries collaborate, they work together. Azerbaijan, for instance, could not sell its oil or send its oil to a terminal in the Mediterranean unless Turkey would allow its land to be used for that purpose. Other examples of collaborative projects are here the Pakistan-China Friendship Highway, which we know as the Karakoram Highway. This is actually a sort of a project which was started as a kind of a gesture of friendship, a cooperation between Pakistan and China. And other examples of collaborative projects are projects undertaken by development implementing agencies, and there are a large number of them. For example, USAID, which is very involved in Pakistan, especially since 9/11. CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, or GTZ, which now I think has been renamed GIZ, that is the German Agency for International Cooperation. Now, all these are undertaking on behalf of their respective governments development projects like in Pakistan, for instance. Not only in Pakistan, also other developing countries. But if you take the example of Pakistan, you'll see there are a lot of USAID-funded projects. There are a lot of CEDA-funded projects. There are a lot of GTZ-funded projects. There are projects which are financed by the Swiss agency, or the Norwegian agency, or the Australian agency, or the British agency, DFID. So these are also collaborative projects. They are aimed at bringing countries closer together. The Karakoram Highway, as I had just pointed out, that is a very good example of a collaborative highway. And here on this slide you can see I have got a map of the highway. On the left side you can see Islamabad, Rawalpindi, right here at the bottom. Then you can see this red zigzaggy red line which is going Islamabad, Rawalpindi via Mansehra, Abbottabad, Besham, etc., going on all the way up and terminating at Kashgar. This is in China's Xinjiang province. And the Khunjara Pass, that is the border between China and Pakistan. The Karakoram Highway goes all the way up and all the way through Xinjiang province from south to north. Now this Karakoram Highway is also the highest asphalted road in the world, and constructed by China and Pakistan in partnership. Commissioned in 1986, so just some data here you might like to have a look at. By the way, getting accurate data is not easy. You look at 5 different sources, you will find 5 different times and 5 different estimates. So just don't believe each and everything about these data over here. Take them as approximate only. 20 years of construction, 1,300 kilometers long, very high. A lot of people unfortunately have died making this highway, about 800 Pakistanis and 50 Chinese. So very high toll in life also. And also there's been a project to expand the width of the highway, which was signed in 2006, because the highway is not broad at certain places, and now they're trying to expand the breadth so that also more traffic can take place along it. But this is a very good highway. A lot of people, a lot of goods, a lot of ideas have moved across this highway in the last 25 or so years. So it's been a very good project, a collaborative project between China and Pakistan, and also you could say the envy of many countries who have been following it. Another example of collaborative projects, the Nabucco pipeline, which lately has run into some difficulties, but this is one of the pipeline projects going from Central Asian republics and Azerbaijan to Europe, bypassing the Russian Federation. You can see here this pipeline system extending from Turkey's eastern frontier, passing through Bulgaria, Romania and Hungary, and terminating at the gas distribution hub Baumgarten in Austria. Will enable the sale of gas from Azerbaijan to Western Europe. And this pipeline also will have other lines going to possibly Iran, Iraq and Egypt. And then from there the gas will go to Western Europe and it doesn't have to cross Russia. So it's designed also to reduce Western Europe's dependence on Russian gas supplies. A few years ago there was a big sort of issue between Russia and Ukraine, and gas supplies to Europe were disrupted as a result. So what this pipeline does, it's a win-win situation. It's a win-win for the gas-producing countries, such as Azerbaijan, possibly Iran, Egypt, because they can market their gas. They will get the proceeds from marketing their gas. Turkey will get its transit royalties and maybe some of the gas, and so will these other Eastern European countries. And Western Europe will be able to get a new source of gas. They don't have to rely then on Russia exclusively. But in case the Russian supplies or the supplies from Russia are not coming, then they can also make use of this other gas which is coming. So it's a win-win situation for all. Excellent example of a collaborative project. Projects as relationship drivers for relationship building and conflict resolution between countries which traditionally are at loggerheads, that is in conflict with each other. There are projects which seek to build bridges of understanding between peoples. In the case of India and Pakistan, A very good example is the Track 2 dialogue, or people-to-people diplomacy, which have been organized to bring together citizens from India and Pakistan, and also they have been applied in the Middle East and in the Korean Peninsula, and also in South America somewhere, I believe. So you can have these types of projects which are done at the people-to-people level. They're not done at the state-to-state level, or they're not done at the public sector to public sector level. That was, I thought, important to point out, that collaborative projects can also take place at the grassroots level, at the people-to-people level. Okay, so now we have looked at the divisive projects, we have looked at the collaborative projects. Now what we have to look at are the third category, the so-called, what I call the integrative projects. Integrative from integration. Integration is more than collaboration. Collaboration is like working together, cooperating with a certain objective in mind, a coordinated form of cooperation with an objective in mind. Integration is more substantive. Integration is, when you're actually trying to sort of merge your different frameworks. You're trying to evolve a common framework from different frameworks. In collaborative, you have your own independent frameworks, but in integrative, you're trying to have a common joint framework. These projects, integrative projects, serve as constituting elements of a long-term transnational grand strategy intending to integrate the economies, the infrastructure, and the institutional, political, legal, and other systems of states, and bring their societies close together. Now, there have been many such attempts. Some attempts have been modest. Some attempts have been very far-reaching, very determined. Now, the examples I've given here, you can see ASEAN, Mercosur, GCC, you can also say SAARC. They are very modest. ASEAN maybe a little more, but yeah, ASEAN is a little more. Mercosur, GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. In Southeast Asia, several states. Mercosur is in South America. These have been some modest examples, where they have tried to integrate their economies and their infrastructure and their various systems through integrative projects and programs. The most substantive example, the most far-reaching attempt to integrate has been, of course, in the European Union, the EU, which you hear and you read about all the time. And this is what we're going to look at now in a little bit more detail. The European Union, how it came about. It's not been around that long. It started after the Second World War. And it has grown out of a realization. A realization because, for centuries, the European states, they were always in some form of conflict with each other, which was due to a lot of competition for power, competition for resources, competition for influence within Europe and outside Europe. And it was this nationalism and intense competition, this combination of nationalism and intense competition, which actually resulted in some very unfortunate situations during the last century. One was the First World War, also known as the Great War, from 1914 to 18, which has really destroyed generations of young people. Second was the Second World War of 1939 to 45, which really has wreaked havoc on the European continent and also in Asia, and large numbers of people had died. Estimates to say about 55 million people, including about 20 million in the former Soviet Union. So dreadful situations took place as a result of this conflicts. And it was this realization that something has to be done, that such conflicts can never be allowed to happen again. The people have to live with each other. They have not got to fight each other. And that after 1945, when the Second World War was over, relations between the European nations, they started to take on a new dimension. And these relationships, which were previously defined by conflict, were now redefined. And they redefined in the spirit of peaceful coexistence and cooperation in pursuit of common goals. And then there were various measures which took place, like the coal and steel union between Germany, France, and the Netherlands and Belgium. Coal and steel were the essential ingredients of war, and it was thought that one should take these essential ingredients of war and form a union over there. And then, of course, other things took place. The Treaty of Rome and European Economic Community came about. Initially, it was mainly French, German, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy. Then it expanded. Britain came in, Spain came in, Portugal came in, Greece came in, etc. And from all these attempts at integration, the European Union had gradually evolved. And now European Union has become a very powerful entity. The countries which make up the European Union, they're still, of course, independent, and they have their own policies, but there is a lot of consistency, and there is a very, very high level of integration in all fields in the European Union. And it's under this European Union, under the patronage of the European Union, that so many integrative programs and projects in many different diverse areas and on a massive scale were initiated over time. And it's really that, influenced by these and by other developments, the threat of armed conflict in Western Europe has receded into oblivion. I mean, it really wouldn't take place again. And most Europeans now acknowledge that they share a common future with common goals and aspirations. So it was this systematic effort which really was sort of driven on by Germany and by France. And here, in this picture on the left, you can see German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, who has rebuilt Germany after the Second World War, and French President Charles de Gaulle embracing here the signing of the Élysée Treaty in 1963. So driven on by France and Germany, and then including all the other European countries, this integration has been taking place, and this integration is founded on a large number of projects and programs. Because unless you have projects and programs, you cannot bring about integration at the level which they have aspired to bring on. Now, the number of projects and programs, integrative projects and programs under the European Union is so large that it's not possible to present them all over here. I'll just pick out a couple of examples, so you get the point. A core feature of the European Union's integration strategy is its emphasis on promoting contacts between its citizens by sponsoring many programs and projects in this regard. European Union has always, looked at integration not only in terms of states, in terms of public sector, in terms of ministries and governments cooperating with each other, but it has looked at it a lot in terms of the citizens, the average people on the street, the individuals, the families, the communities. It has always been encouraging them to network, to interact with each other across European national borders. One example, a very good program, is the Erasmus exchange program. Erasmus was a great Dutch humanist living, I think, in the 16th century. And he was already at that time, he was trying to promote sort of cooperation between the people of Europe. And after him, this program has been named. And this has been designed specially for students, that they can go under this program. French students, for instance, can come to Germany and study for some time at a German university, or Dutch students from Holland, they could then go study for some time at an Italian university. So by encouraging this movement of young people, encouraging them to spend some time in another country to study there, to get to know other young people over there, the European community has been trying to promote this contacts between peoples. Many European cities, many European towns, they have got twinning schemes. Twinning means that one European town will partner with another European town or other European towns in some other countries, and they will then, you know, sort of have cultural events. They will encourage their citizens to visit. You know, they might organize tours of the other cities, and so forth, and so forth. One example here is, you can see these two pictures on the left. These are two cathedrals. The one on the top is the Cathedral of Speyer, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, Romanesque cathedral in the world. It's about 1,000 years old. It's undergone many changes over time, but basic structure is about 1,000 years old. I picked it out because this is the town where I did my PhD in Germany. This building on the bottom, that is the cathedral at Chartres in France, and there's a very old and very famous cathedral. And Chartres and Speyer in Germany, where I studied, they are partner cities. They have this partnership ongoing. So often when I was in Speyer, I used to hear, you know, maybe people from Chartres are coming, they're visiting the town. People from Speyer are going to Chartres, they're visiting the town. Dialogue is taking place, discussion is taking place, and so forth. So, and there are many of these twinning schemes which are ongoing in the European Union, in the countries which constitute the European Union. So it's a very interesting project which brings together people from different localities systematically. Also, I should point out that you know, many common institutions have been established by the European Union. You know, like a common office for statistics, a common office for weather. There is this European police, Europol, where police officers from different European countries, they come, they sit, they share information, they work on their strategies. There are all kinds of European Union commissions and so forth. It's a huge number. The subject area is so vast, you know, that you could maybe do a whole degree program just on that. The point which I'm trying to make over here is that integration can be brought on, provided one goes about it systematically, and there is commitment. A commitment at all levels, not only at the top level, but also at, across down to the bottom level, at the grassroots level. And there are many different ways in which one can foster integration, and all this is done primarily through programs and projects. Well, that's it basically. What I wanted to say about secondary stakeholders. As you can see, we have gone over a lot of material just for the secondary stakeholders, leaving aside the primary stakeholders. You can see that there are a lot of interests which are here. There are a lot of stakes, and there are a lot of relationships to projects. And you can see that a project which is being done over here may possibly have repercussions in other countries. It might have repercussions on the other side of our planet. And that is why it is so important always to look at stakeholders and not to focus solely on the technical side of a project, to focus on the scheduling side of a project, to focus on the cost side of a project, and so forth, or the scope of a project, but also to look beyond your nose and also look a little bit beyond the horizon and try to see how the project which you are doing may affect others along the line. You might find, if you look at it systematically, that a lot of stakeholders are affected who you might never have even considered, or you might never have even thought about. But now that you look about it systematically and you use some of the processes and tools which we will be covering in this whole course, you will be in a better position to understand who the stakeholders are, to identify them, to analyze their concerns, and also how to manage and how to engage them properly. Well, that's all for today. In the next lecture, lecture number 11, we shall move on to the next part of our course, and in which I will look at the 9 factors, again this is based on my own research, which are creating, which I believe, I perceive, are creating interest in project stakeholder management among academics as well as practitioners. It's through my research I've identified these 9 areas, and we will start going through them all in your next lesson. So we have looked at stakeholders, we have looked at primary stakeholders, we have looked at secondary stakeholders, we have looked at some of the fundamental areas of project stakeholder management, what stakeholder management is all about, and what are some of the important things one has to keep in mind when considering stakeholders. Now we will be going to a different area, the 9 factors, the driving factors, and then after we have done that, we will start going into the project stakeholder governance model, which I have also developed, and especially the methodological component of that governance model. So that's all for today. Thank you very much, and I say we'll see you then in the next class.